Welcome to a special edition of the Spiked podcast. As the Brexit deadline draws ever closer, the cries of panic over the effects of a no-deal Brexit get ever louder. Every day, we're subjected to new and ever more lurid scare stories, warning of an instant and painful recession, food and medicine shortages, and even civil unrest if we leave the EU without making a deal. But how seriously can we take these predictions? Is leaving the EU on WTO terms really so bad for the economy? And what are the opportunities that a clean Brexit might offer? I'm Fraser Myers, and on this week's Spike podcast, I spoke to two Brexit-backing economists, The Guardian's Larry Elliott and Spiked's Phil Mullen, to find out more.
The economy crashes by 8% in a single year as house prices tumble by a third and inflation soars to 6.5%.
The port of Dover would shut down on day one of Brexit.
3,500 troops are on standby.
Some members of the public are taking matters into their own hands, stocking up on essential goods in case supplies in the shops run low.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Spike podcast, where we'll be discussing the economics of Brexit, the myths around no deal, the opportunities for post-Brexit Britain, and more. I'm Fraser Myers, and today I'm joined by The Guardian's economics editor, Larry Elliott.
Hello.
And Phil Mullen, author of Creative Destruction, How to Start an Economic Renaissance.
Hello.
So, no deal is generally portrayed as a disaster. You often hear it described as crashing out or a cliff edge Brexit. Is that a fair way to describe leaving the EU on WTO terms?
No, I think all those terms that you've just reminded us are very pejorative. That just the assumption is that this is going to be a disaster. But I think what I find intriguing recently, and I don't know what Larry thinks about it, is that the economic Brexit bashing stories are just getting so bizarre that you sort of feel that they, are not really trying to persuade anybody. Because if you look at the Dyson story, if you look at the Nissan story, if you look at the just-in-time stuff, these people are making such bizarre claims that everything is going to go to hell in a handcart for filling in a few forms or for, some changes in trade patterns. It's just bizarre.
It seems as though that's the only thing the hardcore Remainers have got, is to sort of describe what's going to happen on the 30th of March in almost sort of biblical terms. I mean, apart from plagues of locusts and the Black Death, there's not been very much that they haven't said is going to happen. Shops are going to run short of food, there's going to be no drugs in the hospitals. I mean, it's kind of a bit OTT. Sure.
So you don't buy this idea that there's going to be civil unrest and the Queen is going to have to be evacuated from Buckingham Palace?
Really? It's just absurd.
I think what they're trying to do is just provide cover for all those sort of wavering MPs, because it's not really directed to the public. I mean, if you listen to, Question Time or anything like that, members of the public there are well aware these things are just ridiculous. It just seems to be providing cover to all these wavering MPs to say anything but Brexit. No deal will be such a disaster. You've got to either go for an extension of Article 50 or back May's ridiculous deal.
I don't think the public. I don't think the public are buying Project Fear, Mark 1 or Mark 2. But I think quite a lot of MPs, bless them, are. Yes. I think quite a lot of MPs are buying all that stuff, and they've been completely won over by, the Treasury forecast, the Bank of England forecast. I mean, the Bank of England forecast saying that the economy is going to, that they're going to bang up interest rates by 4 percentage points in the event of a no-deal Brexit. It's just completely ridiculous. The Bank of England would be cutting interest rates. The Treasury would be spending more money. There are things that governments can do. They're not just going to sit there in the event that things do turn nastier than they expect and just say, we're just going to allow this to happen to us. It's just not feasible politics.
And let's take some of these ideas in turn, I guess. So what do you think, what's realistic that we could expect to happen at Dover and Calais, for instance? That seems to be a source of a lot of fear-mongering.
Well, I mean, what we've heard so far from the Calais side is that they're going to keep the port open. That, the idea that the French authorities are going to just say, we're going to, in a fit of pique, close our port to exporting goods to the UK. I mean, they're just not having that, because for one, it's going to cost them business. The business would go to other ports. For two, why would they do that? Why on earth would anybody cut off their nose to spite their face in that way?
I think that particularly the Dover-Calais route, or the Calais-Folkestone route or whatever, also exposes this myth that somehow there is frictionless trade at the moment, because haulage companies, transit companies are well aware that there's not frictionless trade. It takes 35 minutes, I think, to go under the channel, but people expect 2 or 3 hours before they get out at the other end. That's the nature of the business at the moment. And another 2 minutes or 6 seconds, as they say in Southampton, or an hour maybe at the upside, an extra hour's delay, the idea that that's going to be Armageddon is just ridiculous.
Anybody's ever been on the M2 or the M25 knows that you can quite easily sit there for 3 or 4 hours, unexpectedly.
And businesses do not collapse, and the whole just-in-time thing is another of these ridiculous scare stories. I mean, just-in-time is presented as this absolute that all our manufacturing companies are going to grind to a halt if a delivery is 1 hour late or 2 hours late or whatever. It doesn't work that way. Business doesn't work that way. They always have contingency plans for that sort of thing.
And I mean, there have even been times in the past, I guess, where Kent has effectively turned into a car park. We've seen Operation Stack whenever there's strikes at Calais. But why hasn't that ground the economy to the halt in the way that No Deal is portrayed as doing?
Well, I think that's the reality of business. I mean, I agree with Larry, it's Project Fear Mark II, but it's also, I call it Project Fairyland. There's this ideal presented that somehow, business works in this well-oiled supply chain, that nothing ever goes wrong. And as you've just said, whether it's snow on the motorways or industrial action or a breakdown in the Channel Tunnel or whatever, businesses have to be able to cope with reasonable delays, and they do so. They do so at the moment.
Also, it's kind of worth mentioning that the lion's share of the economy is not exports.
Yeah.
Most of the economy is domestically focused. And only 30% of our GDP is trade, of which half goes to the EU, which is about 15% of our GDP. So you have to assume that the whole of that GDP to the EU gets wiped out all of a sudden to have any real major effect on the economy. Most of the economy, the people who go down the road for a drink, or they go to their solicitors to get arrange a mortgage, or any of those things that people do by go and have their hair cut, is going to be completely unaffected. It's not, and I think quite a lot of people have realised that their everyday life is not really going to be materially affected.
I mean, I think we should probably distinguish between two different things. One is, there no doubt will be some teething problems.
Yeah.
Because, leaving the EU is a change.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in this room we would prefer to see leaving the European Union in the way that people voted for it. If that does happen, then that does mean disruption, because it does mean a bit of change. But that's no bad thing. I think one of the problems is that everyone's default setting is just to want to keep things the way they are at the moment. So I think we need to distinguish between the teething troubles, because businesses will have to adapt, but they'll push on, they'll sort it out, they'll get through it, with the more sort of long-term fear-mongering about 5, 6, 7, 8% collapse in GDP, which is this idea that somehow we're so dependent, as Larry's saying, on trade, this assumption that we're so dependent on trade that the whole of the economy is going to go backwards.
Clearly, it would be better if there was going to be a no deal and it was a managed no deal rather than an unmanaged, chaotic no deal. I mean, there would be some economic costs from that, and they would quite easily push the economy, which is not growing that fast, into a short-term recession. But even in the event of a chaotic, so-called no deal, the hit to the economy, I expect, would be fairly short-term and much more modest than anybody is expecting. Because, as I say, the Treasury and the Bank of England would actually reflate the economy very quickly.
Yeah, and if that does happen, I think we should also see that the responsibility lies on government, really, because people voted, nearly 3 years ago to leave, which meant all these changes were going to happen at some time, and yet, because the politician been saying, well, really, we're going to do something which is almost exactly the same as what we had before, they've lulled a lot of businesses into the false sense that we really don't have to change anything. I mean, sensible businesses have been preparing for a couple of years, but a lot of people who don't want to change or are, very happy with the status quo have taken the lead from government that really there's not really going to be any change, and therefore a lot of people are underprepared. And that means that any disruption there is, I think, is going to be made worse by the political leaders we've had who've been so incapable of actually implementing a decision.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask a bit more about that, because obviously there have been some almost kind of laughable stories. You think about the Chris Grayling debacle, where he's chartered a ferry company that owns no ferries. I mean, how much confidence can we have that these people who, let's be honest, don't want us to leave the EU have actually prepared adequately for us to leave?
I think we have to distinguish, businesses from the civil servants and the tax people and so on, and the politicians. And I think there's three different dynamics there. I think a lot of the administrators, a lot of the people running the British civil service, and, the French civil service and, the Calais port, as Larry says, and so on, a lot of people have been preparing for the eventualities. That's what they should be doing. And that has rolled down to some businesses who, a very good example people have looked at is Next, who did a very controlled risk management as to what the impact for the next retailer is going to be of any potential delays at Calais or whatever. So some businesses then are prepared in that way, just as normal risk management in terms of what might or might not happen. I think the problems are really at the top, where they've just gone from, on the one hand, saying nothing's really going to change, this is all we can do, that we're going to have to go with this deal because no deal is so bad and stuff. It's those mixed messages from the politicians which I think have added to the confusion elsewhere. And maybe it has meant that some civil servants haven't had the leadership they should have had from their ministers to actually prepare properly. But my view is that what disruption will be, the responsibility should be laid fairly and squarely on the government for not having taken the last 2.5 years to prepare for something which people voted for.
They would have been much better off preparing for a clean Brexit right from the start, because we would have been much better prepared now, rather than have, a typical sort of British, it's a bit like sort of preparing for war in 1939. All of a sudden you realize, oh my God, this guy really means it. We better prepare for it. And then you do everything at the last minute. There's that. And also it would have actually strengthened Britain's negotiating hand in the talks with the EU, had they thought right from the start that we were serious about going for a clean Brexit and leaving the single market and the customs union. We would have got, I'm sure, a much better deal. As it was, our negotiating position was fundamentally weakened by the fact that they knew that our politicians didn't really want to leave on those terms. They wanted to stay in on the sort of, with the biggest sort of sweetheart deal they could possibly get. So, it was Brexit in name only. That's, the European side realised that very early on.
One other thing, just on the specifics of no deal. I mean, there's obviously, it throws up this question of tariffs. And you're completely right to say that a large part of the economy isn't trade, but a large part of what people are buying in the day-to-day might be affected by that. How adversely do you think will be affected by increasing tariffs? Do we even have to slap tariffs on EU goods? What are your views on that?
Well, we don't have to slap tariffs. I mean, there are some economists, there's some free market economists who say that actually what we should do is just abolish all our tariffs on EU goods. But once you've done that, you've got to abolish them under the WTO rules. You've got to abolish them on goods from everywhere, because there's a principle known as most favoured nation, which means if you offer zero tariffs to one group of people, you have to offer them to everybody. And so their argument is that what would happen is that the price of imported goods would go down very, very sharply. Consumers' real incomes would go up, therefore we'd buy a load more stuff, and therefore we would be better off. There is a logic to that, although it would mean severe problems for some sectors of the economy if you did that. Cars, for one, because at the moment there's a 10% tariff on cars imported from outside the EU, and food, and farmers would be affected. So there's those. If the government is going to go down that route, and it would have to make specific contingency plans for those two sectors, or they would be, certainly car industry would face really serious problems. And the other problem is if you're going to go into a trade negotiation with another country, if you say that we're going to abolish all our tariffs, then what have you got to bargain with? So you have to be slightly careful about that route. But in theory, there's no reason why you have to impose tariffs.
I mean, tariffs, I think, are a bit exaggerated in terms of what their impact is. As a point was made just after the referendum, a 10% drop in or 15% drop in sterling, as happened, was much, much more significant on import prices and export prices than average tariffs of 3, 4, 5%. I mean, Larry's right. Agricultural produce is much higher. Cars are 10% and stuff. So I think we should see them in a bit of perspective, because really the thing that messes up trade today is much more what's called non-tariff barriers, regulations and controls for environmental health and safety and so on. Those are the things which hinder and distort trade much more than the actual tariff levels. I mean, I'm not a tariff expert, I'm not a legal expert, but I'm aware of this discussion going on at the moment about Article 24 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which does seem to, there is ambiguity about it, there is debate about it, but it does seem to provide the provision for two parties, in this case Britain and the EU, if there was to be an exit, whereby they could agree to an interim arrangement while they negotiated a free trade agreement. And that interim arrangement would be on the basis of the existing levels, i.e. no tariffs. That does involve an agreement between the EU and Britain. But if we were to get to that stage, and I think it's a big hypothetical, if we were to get to that stage, that would be, I think, a more sensible thing to do. That is, leave the European Union, leave the single market, agree with the EU for zero tariffs during the interim arrangement while a free trade agreement is negotiated. I mean, that's another area that our negotiators or our political leaders were completely incompetent by giving up the idea, which they rightly had at the beginning, that we should use the Article 50 period for negotiating or beginning to negotiate a free trade agreement. And they just backed down completely when the European Union said, no, we're not doing that. We can't negotiate anything like that until afterwards.
There's quite a lot of, unnecessary gloom about negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU. I mean, I think it would be definitely preferable to have a free trade agreement. And the EU is still our biggest trade partner by far, so it makes a lot of sense. Countries that trade on WTO terms tend to have trading agreements with their closest partners, which is why the US has a trading agreement with Canada and Mexico, although it's been kind of messed around a bit by Donald Trump. But I mean, essentially, Australia and New Zealand have a free trade agreement and so on. But I mean, there's an awful lot of talk about how it would take 10, 15 years to negotiate a trade agreement between Britain and the EU, but that seems to me to be ridiculously pessimistic, because we already have pretty much free trade between in goods between the countries, and there are some we are aligned with all their regulations. So it's only going to take years and years and years for two countries which have got systems which are massively different. Our systems are already pretty much closely aligned. So with some goodwill, I'd have thought you should be able to negotiate something relatively quickly.
Yeah, I think that's on a par with all the other panic mongering which there is to say it's going to take 6, 7, 8 years. These things are so complicated, so complex. I mean, I think the average is something like 18 months to 20 months on a global table, and that's between parties which have got different trade arrangements. As Larry says, we're starting from exactly the same patterns and regulations on both sides. So no reason why it would come in a year or two, definitely not.
So we could potentially, say, for instance, leave on the 29th of March, but then begin to negotiate a free trade deal for the future.
Yeah, the Canada plus, as people tend to call it. A trade agreement which includes goods and services and involves, mutual recognition of regulations on financial services, all those good things that, many trade experts have already spelt out in great detail. There is no need for us to get uptight about how you can overcome, as Larry says, between two major trading partners. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. It's in everyone's interest to get that sort of agreement.
I'd just like to take a really quick moment to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been donating to Spiked. I know many of you who listen to this podcast have donated to us in the past or make monthly donations, and it's thanks to your contributions and generosity that we can keep going and growing. Spiked has some very exciting plans for the year ahead with our podcasts, and we need the help of listeners and readers like you to make them happen. So, if you haven't before, please do consider making a donation, or even better, setting up a monthly donation. It's really easy to do. Just go to spiked-online.com and click the red donate button in the top right corner. Thank you. Now, back to the show. It could be the case that the direction of travel takes us actually towards May's deal, perhaps with an amended backstop or something like that. But what do you think are the potential dangers in May's deal? Why is no deal preferable, particularly to that outcome?
Well, May's deal seems to me you get none of the real benefits of leaving, and none of the benefits of being in. I mean, you're the whole sort of it's essentially a Norway position where you are accepting most of the rules of the EU without having any say in how the rules are made. I mean, that is the fundamental weakness in theoretical terms. In practical terms, the weakness is that if we get screwed by the EU over the transition deal, over the withdrawal agreement, then they're going to screw us on the trade deal as well. I think we have to show a little bit more savvy, really. I mean, I can see why people say that being outside the EU on May's terms is like being a vassal state, because there is something in that, I think.
And obviously, it seems to be an attempt to try and replicate a lot of the conditions of the single market and customs union that we should be leaving. Do you think the benefits of those things are exaggerated in the general discussion?
One has to separate the economics and the politics from it, I think, because I'm in favour of much more extensive, developed international division of labour, product specialisation, all those good things that come with closer economic relationships on an international level. And that's, what informs a lot of the free trade agreements around the world and so on, and informs the general process of liberalisation. But distinguish that from what comes with being part of the Soviet Union. The reason Soviet Union with the European Union is all the politics of it, is the denial of sovereignty. And we have to remind ourselves in a discussion on the potential economics of Brexit, why did people vote to leave? They voted on the basis of sovereignty, on the basis of democracy. Those are the things which have got no benefits, and you can't balance the two up. You can separate them, but it's not a matter of comparing what economic benefits we get here as against the abrogation of sovereignty. And in that respect, that's what people voted about.
I think they did vote, a lot of them, because they actually thought, what? This economy might be working well for the people who own shares in Nissan and British Aerospace and all those multinational companies that are now kicking up a stink about staying in the customs union, but it's not actually filtering down to me and my family. And I think it was a perfectly rational thing to do. They wanted change. They wanted a different sort of political settlement. And if they don't get it, there's going to be an awful lot of anger about it, I think.
I think that's right. There was a vote. It was a vote against the status quo. And I think also, while you're right, people have had a very rough deal over particularly the last 10 years with flat living standards and so on. I think what people were voting for, as illustrated by that Ashcroft poll on the day, very few people said they were voting because they thought it would be good for the economy. I think one in 20 or something said that. Most people voted because it was reflect that general view of taking back control. They thought that laws for the UK should be decided in the UK. They thought there should be a bit more control over the borders and so on. And in that respect, I think the project, the first phase of Project Fear didn't have the impact that people thought it would have. I think people were well aware of all these scare stories and said, well, there might be a bit of disruption, might be this, but that's a secondary factor. I think that experience was a very sort of illustrative one of the fact that ordinary people don't always just get motivated by their pockets, don't get motivated by the economy. There are bigger issues at play. That's not to disagree with what Larry's saying about stagnant living standards. That obviously does add to the disgruntlement. But I think a lot of people have felt that the powers that be, and I think the whole fear-mongering at the moment just adds to that. The powers that be don't have their interests at stake. They don't have their interests at heart. That they're treated in a patronising way, or ignored, or treated with contempt. And people just said, we want a different, as Larry said, a different political settlement. We want something different.
I agree with that, and I think that the idea that people just vote. I mean, I think there was an awful lot of economic unhappiness, but the idea that people just vote on how much money they've got in their pocket, or about whether it's going to grow the economic pie or be good for the economy, is a bit of a myth. And and if you turn it on its head and go to a Remain area of the country, say somewhere around the M25 or with a nice green belt area, and say, well, would you like us to abolish all the planning rules and build loads more houses all over the green belt, because that's going to be good for the economy and grow GDP and make everybody better off? You get pretty short shrift from those people. They would say, there's something more important. Open space is more important. Having a nice place to live is more important. The idea of rational economic man or woman is, people don't always vote on GDP per head anyway.
But also, I mean, one thing that seems to be quite obvious after the vote is that a lot of the forecasting was just wrong in terms of the predictions made about the direct impact of the vote. And why do you think that the Bank of England and the Treasury and all those people got it so wrong?
Well, I mean, again, you have to distinguish what the sort of political standing point is, and how that gets manifest in terms of their public statements. And I think all those institutions have a profound attachment to the status quo, and so it's hardly surprising. It's not a conspiracy. It's hardly surprising that their models that they from which they derive their economic forecasts, and they've all got basically pretty much the same models. They put in the assumptions that things are going to be bad, and lo and behold, the models come out and declare that things are bad. I think it shows the folly of this overwrought Brexit preoccupation, because these models are based on what they call everything else being equal, ceteris paribus. And that's the problem at the moment. They assume everything else is not going to change because that's their default position. We want things to stay the way they are. And that avoids then the much deeper problems, which got nothing to do with being in the EU or nothing to do with Brexit or nothing to do with referendums or whatever, which is this very long established lack of investment, low productivity, the sort of forces which have created that flatlining of living standards that Larry described. Those models assume that nothing's going to change in that, whereas it's precisely these other factors which is where we should be focused. We should be worried about economic problems. Britain's got a lot of problems which got nothing to do with Brexit, nothing to do with Brussels, nothing to do with EU regulation, whatever. They've got deep-rooted problems which this whole Brexit bashing discussion is diverting us from and is distracting us from.
I think there were two phases of the sort of economic wrong-headedness of the Treasury in particular, but also the Bank of England. The first phase was, when they said, here are the long-term implications of Brexit, which was kind of a bit more measured, and but it was based on some really, really dodgy assumptions, and one of which was that all the increase in trade that we had from the joining the EU in 1973 would be lost straight away. That we would lose all those benefits immediately. We left the EU, and that we would have no compensating increases in trade elsewhere. Now that seemed to me to be a pretty absurd set of assumptions. And even then, they were saying that in 2030, I think it was 15 years afterwards, our economy would be 6% smaller than it would otherwise have been. Which, given that the economy in 2016 was 20% smaller than it had been in 2010, and no one spotted it. And as Phil says, it all presupposed, one, that you get no benefits from the fast-growing parts of the world, and B, that the government would just sit there and allow this to happen, that there would be no government which said, well, here's an opportunity. We've left the EU. We've left the EU for a reason, which is that people are very unhappy with the status quo. What can we do to actually put right some of the failings of the economy? I think the second phase of it was more pernicious, which is when it was quite clear that the establishment was on the run in May and June, early June 2016, and then they just panicked and decided that they would all they could do really was just turn up the volume. And then they started saying things like house prices will fall by 30%, the economy will go into a 2-year recession, there'll be 500,000 more people unemployed. I think they just hit the panic button. And to be honest, I think that made things worse for them, because at that point people just said, we don't believe in any of this stuff.
And is the forecasting around no deal equally flawed? I mean, particularly from the Bank of England and the Treasury.
I think actually that the Treasury and the Bank of England could quite easily talk us into a recession that we don't need to have. And if that happens, the politicians will bear a heavy responsibility for that, I think, because I don't think there's any objective reason why the economy should crash. Consumers spending is about 2/3 of the economy, and wages are going up faster than prices. People should be out there spending money, and they're not. Interest rates are still low. Employment's very strong. All the conditions are there for actually the economy to be growing fairly robustly. There's certainly the domestic economy, and I don't see any reason other than that people are starting to get a bit scared because the politicians, all they do, they turn on the TV every day and there's someone banging on about how we're all going to go to hell in a handcart.
I think we might part ways a little bit there, because I don't think things are as strong. The fundamentals aren't strong at all.
No, the fundamentals aren't strong. But in the short term, there's no real reason why there's
no immediate reason. But I mean, that's one of the problems with this whole discussion. Not our discussion, but the discussion out there, that everything is so Brexit focused that people forget there are some serious problems out there. I mean, if it wasn't for Brexit, we should be discussing the fact that the Federal Reserve did this amazing U-turn last week on monetary policy, where we have a situation where what we are 10 years after the financial crash. real interest rates are still negative. Even in America, where they've started to put up interest rates, they're still barely positive. And now people are fearful about what that's going to do to the economy. So when you have that situation, I think that is an indication of underlying weakness of fundamentals, not just in Britain, but in many other advanced economies. In those circumstances, anything can happen. And in that sense, Larry's right that talking an economy down in the way, or talking the problems up, can, in this situation, aggravate the situation. It won't be Brexit causing the problems, or leaving the EU causing the problems. It'll be the way in which a weak economy is talked into a worse recession than it needs to have.
I mean, it's clearly the case that our economy has some serious long-term problems, and has had them for many, many decades. These are not just problems which have arisen as a result of the financial crisis. We've since the early 1980s, we've not run a manufacturing trade surplus in one single year. Our balance of payments in trade has been negative for getting on for 4 decades. We've had zero productivity growth pretty much in the last 10 years. These are serious long-term. The economy is so heavily weighted towards London and the South East, which is another reason that people in the northern regions voted strongly for Brexit. There's a very, very strong anti-metropolitan London elite in all this. We don't like London, which gets more than its fair share of public investment and so on. The British economy is in many ways fundamentally weak. Yeah. And that's why people like me supported Brexit, because I actually thought Brexit was an opportunity to start dealing with those long-term problems. And one of the issues I have with the Remainers is that they just want to turn the clock back to June 2016, and then, as if the status quo is going to resolve all those problems. But I might be introducing them unfairly, but so far I've seen nothing from the Remain side which suggests they've got a plan for putting right any of those problems.
No, and any bright ideas they may have had from time to time have been put on the back burner. I mean, there was all this discussion 2 years ago about this new industrial policy, and it's obviously good to have that sort of discussion. But that's all been sidelined. Unfortunately, I agree with Larry that what's going to come out of this, whatever happens on the 29th of March, there's no clear ideas coming forward from any side at the moment that there are these serious long-term problems, economic problems, which need solutions. And being in the EU or out of the EU is not going to resolve or aggravate them.
And, talking of these kind of long-term problems, I mean, we've also seen problems start to arise in the Eurozone. So Italy in technical recession, people are afraid about what might happen to Germany. I mean, what do you make of those developments?
Well, I mean, one of the things that always has kind of amused me since the referendum is that all the people that before 2016 would say things like, well, it's absolutely terrible what the EU has been doing to Greece, and the EU is just obsessed with austerity, and is forcing countries to cut their budgets and so on. Have completely forgotten all that. As far as they're concerned, the EU is this land of milk and honey, when it quite clearly isn't. The euro has been an absolute disaster for the countries that joined it. The only country that you could say has done well out of the euro is Germany, and then it's not really the German people, it's German exporting companies that have done well out of it. Living standards in Germany have not really gone up that much, but if you look at Italy, where they've had no growth in their GDP per head is as low as it was in the late 1990s. If you look at France, where they've got massive unrest on the streets, if you look at unemployment across the European Union, it's double what it is in the UK. This is an economy that's really, really struggling. And the more integrated the Europeans try to make their economy, the worse things get, in my view. So that's one of the other reasons why I'm not at all frightened about Britain being outside the European Union. Is that I think in 5 years' time, the European Union is going to be in a much worse state than the British economy.
Yeah, and it shows, I mean, it has all those dire economic consequences you said to particularly the people in Southern Europe, although, as you say, people in Northern Europe haven't done all that well if you're looking at the working class people. But it does show just where you come to when you have this politically illegitimate institution known as the European Union, when it imposes these rules, which do have these terrible economic consequences, and there's no legitimacy for it. And therefore you have this growing unrest in many parts of the European Union, of people not wanting to come out and support the breakup of the EU yet, but a lot of anti-Euro sentiment. A lot of people can see that the Euro is causing problems, and whether they want it or not, the Euro is a very, very unstable institution.
Yeah, I'm not a great supporter of the Italian government, but they've had zero growth in Italy for 20 years. They've got unemployment in 10% or more. They've got something like 35% youth unemployment. They are a really struggling economy. So, you get a government that comes in and says, we're going to try something different. We're going to try and spend our way to growth through. We're on a higher budget deficit, which, given that the Italian banking system is so impaired and that the low interest rates are not actually working, not actually getting through to higher credit and loans to businesses, economically, there is a totally legitimate case for the Italian government running a bigger budget deficit. Yeah. As soon as it did so, what happens? People in Brussels say, no, we're not allowed to do that under EU rules. And what does that say to the Italian people? I just find it staggering. And at some point, there is going to be a really serious revolt against.
Yeah,
against
there's different variants of this gap between the establishment, whether it's in Brussels, Paris, Rome, or whatever, and the ordinary people. And it just takes different forms, whether it's the Gilets jaunes, whether it's what's happening in Italy, whether it's what's happening in Eastern Europe, whatever. It's different ways in which people don't like being patronised and treated with contempt, and realise that the status quo is not working for them and that we need some change. I mean, that's the real political divide that's coming up, not between populists and internationalists or whatever. It's between those who are wedded to the status quo and those who see that the status quo is not working and that we need some change.
Hi there. I hope you're enjoying the Spike podcast so far. And if you are, why not help us spread the word by giving us a rating and a review with your podcast provider? It won't take long, but it will make a huge difference for us. So we'd be massively grateful if you could take a tiny bit of your time to give us a rating and a review. Right, now back to the show. Well, hopefully we're going to be ditching the status quo soon. I always have to, cross my fingers when I say that because I never know if we're actually going to leave or not. But assuming that we do leave, assuming that we take a clean Brexit path, what's the next step? What's the vision? How do we transform the British economy, make it work for, ordinary people in the way that it should?
It's only going to change if we change things, if we do adopt a completely different economic strategy. We need a really fresh approach to an imaginative economic policy, which can say we have these deep long-term problems. We have this zombie economy, which is just muddling along, where productivity is flatlining. Unless we have a policy which is about building for the future and changing things and not accepting the status quo, then nothing will change. So we do need something which is driving business investment. We do need something which is driving long-term innovation, which is more R&D. We do need a policy which can change, say, energy costs for business, energy costs for people, the sort of things which can actually provide a real shake-up to the status quo, to the way businesses are. I mean, I argue a lot that we've just got too many of these zombie businesses holding back the rest of the economy. And even the strongest businesses are being discouraged from investing because they're investing into an anemic, muddling through, go nowhere, slow drift economy. So it needs a good shake-up. Now, unfortunately, that's not going to happen automatically just because we leave, if we do, as you say, hopefully leave the European Union. What matters is a fresh approach to economic policy.
I mean, I think that the left has been really remiss in not putting forward a case for a left Brexit, which would, in my mind, involve things like, a New Deal for the North, and a revival of manufacturing, a national investment bank, maybe a Green New Deal to sort of spread some of the benefits of a green, low-carbon economy to the northern regions, use the universities in the north, as centres of excellence for the new technology, the new sunrise industries of the future, new materials, environmental industries, and so on. Digital technologies. We could think so much more creatively. Yeah. But too much of the left has just buried its head in the sand and said, what all we really need to do here is go back to where we were before because we felt quite comfortable with that. And as a result, they now say, well, Brexit is going to be dominated by the right. And the only reason it will be dominated, if indeed it is because the left has completely capitulated. Change comes about through crisis, and there's no doubt that Brexit is a real political crisis, a real moment of change in the British economy. It could be wasted, but it could be used really, really creatively to recast the economy, because 17 million people didn't vote Brexit lightly. They did so because they were fundamentally unhappy with what was going on. And I think they were right to be unhappy because the economy is clearly not working. And this is the big opportunity for the left to put things right.
Just on one specific thing, I mean, there is a lot of talk among certain Tories, but even only a small proportion of them, that they want to turn Britain into Singapore on Thames or whatever. Then, some on the left say that that's a bargain basement Brexit. What do you think is the likelihood of that? I personally, I find it a bit exaggerated, that kind of talk.
If what is meant by Singapore on Thames is stripping away all labour rights, holiday entitlement, maternity pay, just turning Britain into a very low tax, low regulation economy, well, I mean, that is an option, but I think you would have people in the streets if that happened. I don't really think that's going to fly. And if that's, in some ways, that makes it easier, it should make it easier for a party of the left to say, well, if that's really all the right's got to offer, here is something a lot more attractive. I mean, I don't actually buy the argument that the European Union is the guarantor of all worker rights. A lot of those rights were actually put in place by domestic governments before we joined the EU, and some of our labour rights are actually better than EU rights anyway. So there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about it. But I think that if that's the Tory rights plan, then that's a dead duck.
Are you optimistic then, Larry, about the post-Brexit future?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think I am an optimist. I think that that you've got to be optimistic. I mean, change. I'm not frightened of change. I don't have any doubt that in 5-10 years' time, a lot of countries in Europe will be saying, well, actually, they made the right choice. They got out of this. And they've thrived, and I think we will thrive with the right policies. I mean, an awful lot of the sort of pessimism is based around the idea that you can't do things differently. That if you see a problem, tried the EU, it's not working for us. Okay, it's not the end of the world. We'll just try something else. Let's experiment. Let's do something differently.
I'm excited about that as well in terms of doing something differently, because that to me is the big virtue of the Brexit vote. It wasn't just about leaving the EU; it was about people getting together and saying we can do things differently, or the present way of doing things hasn't worked for us. Let's try and do things differently. That's the exciting thing about this political situation. It's not automatic, as both of us have said. It doesn't necessarily translate into a radical economic policy, but at least it gives the basis that people are open to new ideas and want to see something different. And that's what's really positive about the present environment, despite all the shenanigans and all the backsliding and all the ineptness and incompetence and cowardliness of our politicians. But in terms of people out there, they want to try something different.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Spike Podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, don't forget to give us a rating, a review, or even make a donation. We'll be back next week, but for more Spike content every day, visit spiked-online.com.